They really didn't understand it. But of course, they really had no way to. How could they possibly have known that it was only contagious after long periods of very close contact? The only thing they did know about it was what it looked like and what it did to a person. That they knew well. They understood how it maimed and disfigured people, and that was enough to make them afraid of it. I'm talking about leprosy. Today the disease has been all but wiped out, so maybe we don't appreciate the fear that accompanied that word, leprosy. But in the ancient world of Jesus, it was a red flag word. It brought the same kind of responses as the word plague did in the 1200s, or smallpox in the 1700s, or AIDS in the 1900s. It frightened them. They felt helpless against it, and they were. Now what happens when fear takes over is that people don't act, they react. And the reaction to leprosy was cruel. Sometimes the person would be put to death by his own family. And on the edge of every large city in the ancient world, they dug huge pits. And in those pits lived the lepers. And if by some remote possibility they did manage to get away from that hole and venture out into the streets, they would be quickly greeted with shouts of "Leper! Unclean!" followed by stones and rocks to make them keep their distance. In Jesus' day, a leper couldn't get within 50 yards of a clean person. It was a lifestyle of loneliness, isolation, and hopelessness. It was a walking death. That's the background of the two lepers we meet this morning. The first, Naaman, was desperate to avoid that fate. Our text says that Naaman was a great man, a mighty general, and favored by the king of Aram. But leprosy had no respect for wealth or status. It lumped all classes together as simply lepers. He was about to lose everything. Naaman was desperate for a cure. So desperate that he even paid attention when a slave girl, an Israelite, suggested that Elisha the prophet might be the answer. So Naaman set off for Samaria. But of course, he's a general. He doesn't want to be mistaken for a charity case. So he takes with him a whole entourage of horses and chariots, and what translates to 750 pounds of silver, and 150 pounds of gold, and 10 fine linens, and a letter from his king. He came to buy the goods. He doesn't bother going to the house of God's prophet. He goes to the king of Israel. But the king of Israel has no power to cure him. So Naaman goes on to the house of Elisha the prophet. But all he gets there is a messenger and a simple message. Go wash in the river. Naaman was outraged. He wanted a show, a nice little song and dance. I thought for me, he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. His foolish pride was crushed. Humility, giving ourselves over to God, is where healing begins. But Naaman had another problem he needed to deal with first. Go wash in the river? It was too simple. If Elisha's instructions had been difficult, he would have done them in an instant. But this was insulting. And he stalks off in a huff. We make things so complicated, so much more difficult than they need to be. So often we get into an argument with a friend or a relative or a spouse, and even when we know we're wrong, we don't want to lose the argument, as if it's a contest. So instead of doing this simple thing and admitting it and ending the argument there, In foolish pride, we persist. We dredge up old hurts. We get angry. We get sarcastic. We yell. We call them names. Anything to win the argument. Even storming off like Naaman did. We would rather die, and in Naaman's case, literally die, than do the simple thing. How many of our friendships, relationships, and marriages have suffered because we wouldn't do the simple thing? I heard of a woman whose husband was an alcoholic. She knew he needed help, but she was too embarrassed to talk to anyone about it. She worried and fretted about it for a long time before she finally went to her pastor to ask for help. And he gave her some information on Alcoholics Anonymous. She was outraged. Here she had spent all this time and energy, and all he could give her was some brochures on AA. She needed it to be more complicated than that. But 16 years later, without her husband having a single drink, she realizes that God uses simple things. If the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was wash and be clean? And to make a point, for the third time in this story, it's the servants, people with no power and no prestige, that encourage Naaman to do the healing thing. And he finally does. He goes down to the river and he washes and he's healed. And beyond our reading for today, Naaman begins to worship the God of Israel, the one true God. He realizes that all of his power, all his horses and chariots, have nothing to do with the power of God, the power that can heal, that can give him true life. He finally lets go of his own power and acknowledges God's power. God prefers the simple things. Water, bread and wine, a touch, a helping hand, a kind word. We want to lay down all kinds of requirements for God's mercy, but Jesus doesn't. All he requires is our heart. And so with Naaman, we hear the simple command: wash and be clean. So simple. Go to the river of God's mercy and wash and be clean. This isn't a story about Naaman. This is a story about us. God offers wholeness if we get ourselves out of the way and let God do it. And with the leper, we do the simple thing. We humbly kneel before Jesus and beg, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Jesus washes us in his water and proclaims a simple word: I do choose. I choose you. Be made clean. It's so simple. Amen.